SmartSuite recently put out an amazing new feature for repeating tasks. With just a few clicks, you can take any task inside of your SmartSuite solutions and mark it as a repeatable task, meaning that anytime you complete it, new things are going to be created, new tasks are going to be created from that original task. But this wasn't enough for everybody because a lot of people started to say, I need more complex automation potential. So that's exactly what I'm going to be sharing with you in this video. How you can take this idea of creating a repeating task in SmartSuite, but make it fit your exact use case, no matter what your different automation requirements are. So if that's of interest, stick around and let's get into it. Welcome back to the channel. If you're new here, my name is Gareth. I'm the owner here at Gap Consulting, and it's our mission to help you to get organized and automated with no-code tools. SmartSuite is one of our favorite no-code tools, and here in this video, I'm going to be showing you how you can build some automation directly inside of SmartSuite for those more advanced use cases where you need tasks to repeat. But before we get into this, I first want to invite you to join me for some free automation training. If you're newer to no-code automation, this training is going to give you the fundamental building blocks so that you can start automating any repetitive task inside of your day-to-day operations. Grab that free training at gapconsulting.io/webinar-registration. I'll be sure to include links wherever you found this video, and by signing up there, you will get instant access to our training. But without further ado, let's go ahead and hop on into the heart of things. I encourage you to follow along with me in your own SmartSuite account. And if you don't already have a SmartSuite account, go ahead and use our link wherever you found this video and get signed up for your free trial so that you can follow in these exact steps. Now here I am inside of a brand new solution inside of SmartSuite called Repeating Tasks. Now I first want to draw your attention again to that former video that we did that showcases the new feature of repeating tasks. Any task follows these rules inside of SmartSuite. It's going to have a name, in this case, record a video for YouTube. It's going to be assigned to somebody. Someone on your team has to be responsible for delivering. It's going to have a priority, maybe, maybe not. It's going to have a status. Here are my default status, always starting with backlog, going to in process, ready for review, and then lastly, complete. And then it's got a due date. If you don't have these elements, you don't have a task. You have to have someone accountable, you have to have a status, and you have to have a due date. And here's where SmartSuite's new fancy feature is coming into play. It's got that little repeat, and you can see that this is already set to repeat on September 4th. Now we can actually see that if we drill into this particular due date field, down here on the bottom of the setup here, this is that repeating task element that I was mentioning. I want to first encourage you again to go back and rewatch that video because what we're going to cover here is not going to make a whole lot of sense if you don't already have this foundation. But here we are, we've set up the repeating task so that's going to repeat on Mondays. But here's where I want to draw your attention. In every case, this automation, this repeating task will only be created when the status of the current task is set to completed, at which point it will then take on whatever repetitive pattern you've established, whatever frequency you denoted here. In this case, weekly. Every Monday, weekly, I want this thing to create a new one with the status of backlog. But what if we don't want this automation to be dependent upon the task being completed? This is one of those pieces of feedback that I got on that previous video where people said, this is a cool feature, but I don't want to trigger my automation just on a task being completed. Maybe there's something else or a set of other conditions that you want to consider before repeating your automation. So how can we build this? Well, first what we need to do is turn off our repeating task. Let's get rid of that and save this up. Notice that my little repeating icon is now gone. This task will no longer repeat, and that's what we want. We don't want it to repeat unless we set up other conditions. So let's build those conditions. Now, first and foremost, before we get into building our automation, of course, we need to make sure that this automation does not trigger for all of our different tasks. You can imagine that we might have hundreds and hundreds of tasks, but not all of them should be repetitive. Not all of them need to repeat. So let's add a new field. And I'm going to use a single select field here, and I'm going to establish two different values. A task can either be recurring or it can be unique. Unique meaning it's just that one time. I'm creating this task one time, it's a one-off, the end. Recurring, those are the tasks where, yeah, we're going to need some extra fancy stuff here. This task is going to be recreated in the future. So we set these two different options here. And of course, we want to name this as the type of the task. And then I also really want to be cautious about setting a default. I want my default to be unique because 99% of the time I'm going to create a task. It's going to be a one-off scenario. I don't want all of my tasks by default to start recurring. Only in the case where I override the default do I want it to be a recurring task. Now, after that, I'm going to also set up another field. In this case, it's going to be a date frequency. And what I want is a number field type here. And I'm going to rename this, just go with date frequency. And I'm going to go in days. And here I can set a default if I so choose. I don't care about the precision being at a decimal level. An integer is fine. And I'm going to go ahead and add this field. Now, what's the purpose of this? In the case where my type is recurring, I need to know at what frequency I need it to recur. In our previous example, we had a task on Mondays. Every Monday this thing would recur. This one is set here at the 28th. And so of course my next one I want to have due on the 4th. Cool. So let's go for it. I'm going to set my frequency of 7 days. Now, of course, if it was every other week, I could make this 14 days. If it was every month, I could make it 30 days, etc. Now I'm going to build a calculating formula here. This is going to be a formula field type, and I am going to write a little bit of a complex formula. So I need to go to my advanced editor. Now my first condition is that the type of this particular task must be recurring. If it's not, I don't want to do any calculations. I also must require that there is a due date for this particular task and that I have a date frequency. That is to say that I have a certain number of days that I know I'm going to add to that date. So first I need to build my if condition. If these things all are true. So I set up an if. I'm going to use my if function here. And you'll notice that the if syntax says, here's my expression. This is a logic expression. And if this is true, then I will output a certain value. If it is not true, then I will output a different value. So how can I then express these conditions? Well, I have 3 of them. Remember, I need the type to be recurring, and I need there to be a date and a frequency. So in order for all 3 of those things to be true at the same time, I now need to use an AND function inside of this. And meaning that all 3 of them will simultaneously be true. In that case, then I will move on in my if function. If not all of them are simultaneously true, then I will not move on. So what are those conditions? Let's go. The first one is type. Type here is equal to recurring. That is condition number 1. Now I separate with a comma. Condition number 2 is that I have a due date. Let's bring it in. Lastly, my third condition is that I have a frequency. A frequency must exist, a due date must exist, and my type for this particular task must be recurring. If all of those things are simultaneously true, then I will have an output of true, and if not, I will do an output of false. Now right now, I'm just going to put in some text, true or false. That way I can validate that my formula is working, and once I have validated that it is working, I will then come back and update true and false to be the actual outputs that I want. So inside of these 2 parentheses, between them, I will set up my comma. Now I am in the part where I'm putting in the true output. Let's go with true. And lastly will be false. So here it is, 2 complex formulas written inside of one another. First, I'm running my AND function, and I'm going to perform this particular function. If all 3 of these things are true, then I will output this value true. If they are not, I will output this value false. Let's add this field and see if it's working appropriately. It is. I have a due date. I am type recurring, and I have a frequency of 7 days. Therefore, my formula says true. If I make a change to my frequency type here, and I say, this is actually unique, well, my formula reflects that change and says, no longer true. So I only want this to be set up in the case where these conditions are met and I have that true output. Now we can go back into our formula Notice that I'm taking this formula step by step just to make sure that I am getting the syntax correct at every step in the process. Now what I want to do is actually calculate the next occurrence for this particular function. So in our example, I want to take the date that I have, the due date, and I want to add it to the number of days so that I can calculate the next time that this task will be due. So I'm going to go with date add function right here, drop this in. I'm going to take my due date. Notice here in my syntax, I start with a date, I take a count, and I output a unit. And the unit must be one of the following. Well, I did my frequency in days, so I'm going to be using days. So here I am, date, count, unit. What's my date? It is the due date. Separate that with a comma. Now let's go to the frequency. Let's find frequency on the list here. Here it is, date frequency in days. And then lastly, I'm going to output days. Now, because days is a type of element that I want to include, I want to make sure to sandwich this with some quotations. So let's drop some quotation marks around days, which is going to tell SmartSuite, hey, this is the unit that I want to calculate here. Of course, you could also use different units like hours, like months, etc. But in our case, the frequency that we provided is days. Now, lastly, you'll see that I've got an error here. It's saying if yes and no and date and text cannot participate in the same expression together. That seems a little complicated, but what it means is, hey, hold on. I have two possible outputs here. In one output, I'm going to calculate a date for you. In the other output, I'm going to calculate or output text. I can't output both a date and text with a function inside of SmartSuite. But that's okay because, of course, I don't actually want to output this value of false right here. That doesn't do me any good to output something here. So all I'm going to do is just go back with my due date. I'm just going to output the original due date from the field. Now let's take a look real quick and calculate this output. The only reason I'm including that due date is because SmartSuite requires that if I'm using a date in one place, it's got to be used again in the other part of the expression. So here I am, this formula is calculating. It's saying, look, I've got a due date here, and I know the frequency you're looking for is 7 days from the due date, so I'm going to calculate September 4th. But what happens if my conditions are not met? Well, if I am a unique type, you'll notice that I'm just outputting the same due date again. No change here, but it's important, of course, that I'm outputting a date because that's what I need. So now we have the function built. And this is important because I'm going to need to know this output so that I can create the next task with this due date. So how can I do that? Now we can build our automation. This is where we can come in and say, I am going to say when a record matches specific conditions inside of my tasks. What are those conditions? This is where you can choose what your conditions are. Remember, the original complaint was that people were saying, I want to trigger this automation not based on the task being completed, but by some other rule. No problem. You can set up whatever that rule is right here. Maybe you want to trigger this automation if someone specific is assigned to this particular task. So in my example, maybe me. If I'm the person on the task, I want this automation to work. I want to have a new one created. Of course, we need to also include a very specific condition, and that is that the frequency here exists, right? If we don't have a frequency, well then we can't create this. We can't even run the automation. So the frequency must not be empty. In addition to that, and I also need to make sure that the type here is equal to recurring. Of course, these two are non-negotiable. This is the reason that we did all of the math in that formula to begin with. I'm saying, hey, look, I need to know that date frequency, and I need to know that this particular task type should be recurring, right? And of course, this kind of goes without saying, but we also need to make sure that we have that new date created for us. In our case, I forgot to rename it. It's just called formula. But I need to make sure that this particular function exists. That is, that there is a date for me out there so that this cannot be empty, right? Now, of course, in our case, I wouldn't actually want to run just off of this alone because this would put me in a perpetual loop, right? Because what would happen? Ideally, I would create a new task, and then that new task would create a new task and a new task and a new task, and I would be in a perpetual loop here forever and ever. So make sure that when you're building this, that you're thoughtful about that. You have to have some sort of a condition that is going to be different for each piece that comes into play here. Otherwise, you could get stuck in an infinite loop. All right, next, I'm going to add an action. What's the action? I'm going to create a new record inside of my tasks table using information that came from my previous record. So here, what's the due date? Well, that's going to come dynamically from the calculation that we did in the last formula. Let's go back to our date actions. We're going to look at the dates from the trigger. And you remember that we had the due date. Well, that was the original task. But now I want to say that formula output that's calculating the next due date, let's drop that in here. So I'm updating the due date of the new task with this formula. What else am I going to do? Well, I'm probably going to assign it to the same person. So I go back to members from the trigger, and I can say whoever that first task was assigned to, this one's going to get assigned to them as well. What else am I going to do? Well, I might also add the date frequency. I had a date frequency from the trigger. Let's bring it in here. So the date frequency of the new task is going to be the date frequency from the trigger, right? Pretty straightforward. We go on and on this way. Now, in our case, I would also want to update the type with the type from the trigger, but because I don't want to be in an infinite loop, as I described earlier, I am going to go ahead and leave this blank, but I will bring in the priority, bring in the field from the trigger, the priority field from the trigger. Let's go ahead and add this automation. Of course, give it a name. In our case, it'll be create recurring task, and we will turn it on. So what happens from here? Well, once we have a record that meets these conditions, that is, a new record comes in that's assigned to me with a date frequency, with the recurring type, and it has a new due date, that is that formula, then we will create a new task. Let's be sure to save our changes before we leave and take it out for a spin. Now, this record already exists, so it will not trigger the automation. But if I create a new record and or duplicate this record, well, now I have a new one that meets those conditions that will trigger the automation inside of SmartSuite, as you see right here. So what just happened? I recreated this original record. It then created a new version of the record with the same priority, the same assigned person. The due date, though, stepped up 1 week in advance. Now, you'll also notice, as I mentioned, because I don't want to be in an infinite loop, I set the type to not be recurring again. But if you were using this live, you of course would want to set this up. Just be very thoughtful about the fact that you don't want to get stuck in an infinite loop. And also, don't make the mistake I just made and make sure to copy in the name of your task as well. I should have brought in the title of the task and included it again right here, which I failed to do in my automation. I know we went pretty fast in this video, but there is obviously a lot to cover here. So if there are any questions you have that we did not quite answer, please be sure to drop them below. And in the meantime, keep on building.